Google, Facebook, Amazon, your favorite online news source. If you were like most Americans, you spend an average of 3 hours and 7 minutes every day viewing online content such as this, according to the Interactive Bureau for Advertising. But what most Americans are unaware of is that the rules that have kept the internet neutral and free were dissolved in January of this year. The landscape of the American internet has taken a dangerous turn for the worse. And because of the lack of clear internet neutrality regulations, the internet that is emerging is one that is less free, less neutral, and has more control exerted over it by large telecommunications companies. Michael Weinberg of the digital advocacy group Public Speech says, "Ultimately, the internet will look more like cable television, with a handful of players and a high barrier to entry, and less like the internet as we know it today." Today, I will show why the threats to net neutrality pose a huge problem for us Americans. And I will say why the Federal Communications Commission should reclassify broadband providers as common carriers in order to reinstate net neutrality in the United States. Let's start by taking a look at the problem. And because of the complexity of this problem, I would like to talk about a few facets of how the internet works that speak directly to it. Now, the issue at hand is the nature of business between content providers and broadband providers. Content providers are companies and individuals large and small like Amazon, Google, and Netflix, all the way down to individuals such as myself that have our own websites that provide content that you, as a user, view on your computer. Broadband providers, on the other hand, are companies like AT&T, Comcast, and Verizon that deliver this content to your computer. And these are overwhelmingly large telecommunications giants. Just to give you an idea of how large these companies are, the North American Industry Classification System found that the top 4 telecommunications broadband providers in the United States account for 75.9% of all industry revenue. The internet is truly an information superhighway, and broadband providers own the roads of that highway. So what does net neutrality mean exactly? There are 2 tenets of net neutrality. The first is anti-discrimination. Anti-discrimination means that a broadband provider cannot deliberately speed up or slow down the delivery of content because of their own agenda. The second tenet is anti-blocking, which means that you as a user have the right to view whatever lawful content you see fit on your computer. The bottom line here is that net neutrality means that broadband providers cannot manipulate the content passing through the information superhighway. So now that you have the background, let's move on to the core of the issue of net neutrality. While there's a lot of legislation and judicial hearings on this issue, the most significant legislation was the Open Internet Act of 2010, which was passed by the Federal Communications Commission. Now, the Federal Communications Commission is that agency of the United States that was given authority by the 1996 Telecommunications Act to oversee broadband providers. And this piece of legislation had great intentions, but at the same time was a piece of bad lawmaking. It established net neutrality by providing anti-discrimination and anti-blocking provisions specifically for broadband providers. But at the same time, it made the mistake of classifying broadband providers in a category that exempted them from those same regulations. So on January 14th of this year, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia struck down the Open Internet Act because of that contradiction. Effectively, this destroyed the last net neutrality regulations in the United States. The consumer advocacy group Free Speech released a press release on the next day saying bluntly, "Net neutrality is dead." And this is not to be taken lightly. The ramifications of losing net neutrality are economic, political, and they're personal. Let's take a look at the economic ramifications. The U.S. Department of Commerce estimates that e-commerce reached a whopping $263.3 billion in 2013, and the loss of neutrality regulations is already beginning to destroy that immense free marketplace. Since January, Netflix has begun paying Comcast an undisclosed amount for faster access to Comcast networks. For a startup company that would like to directly compete with Netflix video streaming service, this means that they have to compete with Netflix's unfairly boosted speeds. This is economics 101. We're seeing a decrease in competition and artificially boosted prices in the internet marketplace. There are also political ramifications. The lack of net neutrality regulations gives broadband providers the ability to limit free speech and assert their own political agenda. And while you may think this type of action is reserved for a country like China with a more controlled internet, there are abuses taking place in the United States as well. In 2007, the popular band Pearl Jam was having a concert in Chicago, and Eddie Vedder read the lyrics, "George Bush, leave this world alone." But for those who were viewing this concert online through AT&T's streaming service, never heard these lyrics. And regardless of how you feel about his political statement, this sort of censorship is unacceptable in a free America. Finally, and most importantly, there are personal ramifications of the loss of net neutrality for all of us. Broadband providers can now manipulate the content that they send us, just as they can manipulate the cable television and the channels that they provide to us. They have the ability to charge us separately for different content that we view, and to put limits on what type of content we can view. This is our freedom, this is our choice, and this is our American internet. Allowing this is unacceptable. Fortunately, it is not too late to reestablish net neutrality in the United States, and the current damage is minimal as of January. The solution is for the Federal Communications Commission to reclassify broadband providers as common carriers. This would hold internet service providers or broadband providers to the same neutrality standards that phone carriers and freight companies are held responsible for. These are all companies that transfer goods or content from one person to another, and they should not manipulate it in between. This is also a solution that industry leaders and also FCC commissioners are already calling for. Michael Copps, who was an FCC commissioner from 2001 to 2011, said in a statement on January 22nd, "The time is now for the FCC to reclassify broadband providers as Title II. Title II is the legislative name for common carriers. There is also an immense movement of concerned Americans, such as you and I, who are taking action. On January 15th, the very next day after this court case, a petition was released on whitehouse.gov asking for this reclassification. This petition now has over 105,000 signatures of Americans. Also, the United States would not be the first country to enact net neutrality regulations. Just last Thursday, the European Parliament voted to add sweeping net neutrality regulations to their larger connected continent piece of legislation. The history of the internet begins in the United States. We should be leading the fight for net neutrality, not lagging behind. But this is difficult given the immense lobbying power of these telecommunications giants. The Tennessean estimates that AT&T has spent over $11 million in the past 4 years alone just lobbying in Tennessee. But the FCC has shown willingness to fight for net neutrality with the acts that I've spoken of before. And the commissioners are independently appointed, giving them a unique position to take a stand on this. Our freedom is at stake, and they have an obligation to do so. Now, opponents of net neutrality argue that competition among broadband providers will prevent them from violating net neutrality. However, the competition that they say will prevent this is non-existent. The Federal Communications Commission found that 67% of Americans have 2 or fewer choices for a high-speed broadband provider. Additionally, Susan Crawford, a law professor who served as Barack Obama's Special Assistant for Science, Technology, and Innovation in 2009, found this number to be even higher. She estimates that 77% of Americans have only a single choice for a high-speed broadband connection from their local cable monopoly. The second argument that is made by opponents of net neutrality is that it is a violation of their First Amendment rights to manipulate the content they deliver to us. This is such a backwards argument, that their free speech rights trump ours. The internet was created as a beacon of freedom and expression, and our free speech must come first. In conclusion, the internet is the most significant technological advancement of our era. And because of a free and open internet, a child who grows up living in government housing and going to a public school can utilize online resources to become inspired and become a scientist or a computer programmer. There are countless instances of abuse after abuse after abuse from broadband providers. The FCC must reclassify broadband providers as common carriers to reinstate net neutrality. I want to leave you today with the words from Vint Cerf, who was widely regarded as the father of the internet due to his work on the early internet. He says, "A lightweight but enforceable neutrality rule is needed to ensure that the internet continues to thrive." He goes on to say, "Telephone companies cannot tell consumers who they can call. Network operators should not dictate what people can do online." Thank you.